Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name's David Scobie. I'm the Executive Dean of the New School for General Studies and Milano, the New School for Management and Urban Policy. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you and to introduce tonight's forum on Freud, Secularism, and Jewish History. Our division, with the long, unwieldy name, has newly integrated the New School's two former divisions of General Studies in Milano, and it's dedicated to various themes of intellectual boundary crossing. We have interdisciplinary programs that link the liberal arts with social and professional practice, programs that engage the most important issues of public life, public policy, and public culture. And all of that, I think, makes us a really good host for tonight's forum and for our new program in Jewish Cultural Studies, directed by my colleague Carolyn Berman, whom I'll ask to come up in just a minute. Jewish Cultural Studies is notable in emphasizing public programs and non-credit courses in engaging Jewish studies as a significant public conversation, as well as regular curricular offerings for our degree students. It's also notable for its interest in Jewish secular culture and the contributions of Jewish thinkers and writers, such as Freud, to a variety of secular intellectual traditions. Tonight's program is the third we've offered by Jewish Cultural Studies. The first two were on Jewish cultural pluralism and, fittingly, Jewish scholars at the New School. In the coming academic year, we're expanding our curriculum for students and the public, including courses on Philip Roth, contemporary Israeli culture, and secular Jewish thought. All of this activity of Jewish Cultural Studies has itself been made possible by generous support from the Posen Foundation, and I want to express my own thanks to the Foundation for helping us to open this important intellectual and cultural space. And now let me introduce Carolyn Berman, Chair of Humanities in our division's bachelor's program and Chair of Jewish Cultural Studies, to welcome and introduce tonight's forum.
Thank you, David. This event grew out of discussions amongst the faculty and students in the Jewish Cultural Studies program. And I'm thinking in particular of courses on the origins of secular society, a Jewish intellectual history, secular Jewish thought from Spinoza to Arendt, the Book of the World, interpretation in Freud, Kafka, Benjamin, and Derrida, and a current course on Freud and the secular subject. And I'm pleased to see some students from those courses here tonight and hope that others of you may join us in future semesters. Information on the courses is available in the program and also on our website. I also wanted to express my gratitude to the Posen Foundation for supporting our program and to our co-sponsors for the event tonight within the university, which include the Jewish Text Series and the Psychology Department at the New School for Social Research. I did want to also reiterate that you should mark your calendars for 3 events this spring. The first is University for a Day on Jewish Secularism, which will be a day-long series of 1-hour mini courses taught by distinguished faculty from universities across the country. And that will be March 12th. That evening, we're also hosting a major public panel, a conversation on Jewish secularism, featuring a number of writers and other interesting celebrities. And finally, I wanted to mention a panel on the art of the kvetch, Jewish humor as secularism. And this is going to feature Michael Wex, who is a sort of comedian and raconteur, as well as the author of Born to Kvetch and How to Be a Mensch and Not a Schmuck, among other works. And that will also feature some of our New School colleagues, including Noah Eisenberg, and it's scheduled for April 27th. Now, no discussion of Jewish humor or Jewish secularism can avoid the massive influence of Sigmund Freud, and I'm thus particularly happy to broach some questions tonight with our panel, which will pave the way for our spring events. We're asking tonight some crucial basic questions, or at least I'm hoping that we'll arrive there in the time allotted. How does Freud, the avowed secularist, fit into a Jewish intellectual history? How did Freud write a secular history of religion and the Jewish people in particular, and to what effect? And how can we think about Freud's enormous influence on American culture and the practice of psychology here, as well as in some way Jewish? We will ask these questions tonight with the help of our three guest speakers, David Aberbach, Richard Armstrong, and Andrew Heinze, drawing on their combined expertise in Jewish studies, intellectual history, psychoanalysis, the classics, and American history. And I will now just briefly introduce them. You have their full bios in the program, but for our archive, I will introduce them briefly here as well, and then they will just speak in the order that I've introduced them. Our first speaker is David Aberbach. He's professor in the Jewish Studies Department at McGill University in Montreal, and currently an associate of the Humanities Center at Harvard University. His books include Surviving Trauma, Lost Literature and Psychoanalysis, as well as works in Jewish intellectual history and early Jewish studies. The second speaker, Richard H. Armstrong, is Associate Professor of Classical Studies at the University of Houston. His most recent book is A Compulsion for Antiquity, Freud and the Ancient World. He is currently writing a book entitled Theory and Theatricality, Classical Drama and the Culture of Early Psychoanalysis. And our third speaker is Andrew Heinze, who received his PhD in American history from the University of California, Berkeley. He's the author of Adapting to Abundance, as well as Jews and the American Soul, which Publishers Weekly named one of the best books of 2004. In addition to being a historian and scholar, he is and has become a playwright and is the author, among other works, of the one-act comedy, The Bar Mitzvah of Jesus Goldfarb. Finally, let me introduce our moderator who will moderate the discussion afterward, my distinguished colleague, Richard J. Bernstein, who is Vera List Professor of Philosophy at the New School for Social Research and the author, among many other works, of Freud and the Legacy of Moses. And now we will begin with David Aberbach.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Carolyn. And I'm going to talk about Freud in the context of his time. And in doing so, I'd like to start with a dream that Freud had that he relates in his book, The Interpretation of Dreams. And this dates from 1895. This is what he writes. On account of certain events which had occurred in the city of Rome, it had become necessary to remove the children to safety. I was sitting on the edge of a fountain and was greatly depressed and almost in tears. Then Freud goes on to interpret his dream. He says that it's an allusion to the classic picture of the Jews in exile in Psalm 137. By the waters of Babylon, we sat down and wept. The dreamer knows that he is in Golos, in exile, vulnerable to the so-called Gezeres, the decrees, the sufferings decreed by the Gentile world. And this is his interpretation. The Jewish problem, concern about the future of one's children, to whom one cannot give a country of their own, concern about educating them in such a way that they can move freely across frontiers. All this was easily recognizable among relevant dream thoughts. We are reminded in this dream that psychoanalysis was invented in the late 19th century at the same time as racial anti-Semitism, which was taught as a so-called science by highly regarded academics at the universities. Racial anti-Semitism at that time was respectable and popular. The highly esteemed philosopher and economist Eugene Düring, for example, taught that the Jews were a parasitical race which the superior Nordic race must destroy by killing and extermination. Yet racial prejudice and genocidal language were found throughout pre-1914 Europe. Germans commonly spoke of others, not just Jews, in stereotypical terms, and of Africans and East Europeans as particularly backward and racially inferior. The German religious prejudice that emerged in the short-lived Kulturkampf against Catholics in the mid-1870s was harsher than any anti-Semitic campaign outside Russia before 1933. French intolerance was similarly not directed exclusively against Jews, as the Dreyfus affair might have suggested, but against many other groups as well, as the historian Eugene Weber has pointed out. And these included Germans, Belgians, Poles, North Africans, and especially Italians. It might even be said that prior to World War II, the Jews got off lightly. But we are not speaking just of genocidal language. In Freud's lifetime, there were genocides in Bulgaria, the Belgian Congo, the German colony of Namibia, Armenia, Soviet Russia, and the Far East, with millions of victims. Joseph Conrad's novella Heart of Darkness, written during the same period as Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams in the late 1890s, exposes the hypocrisy of secular European Enlightenment with its ideals of modern education and progress leading to genocide. Let us consider more closely the Europe in which psychoanalysis was born. By the end of the 19th century, there were about 4 anti-Semitic political parties in Europe. In Vienna in the 1890s, anti-Semitism alone unified the Christian social coalition headed by the mayor Karl Lueger. Democrats, German nationals, clericals, artisans' leaders, even liberals. The Social Democrats, for whom Freud voted, regarded total assimilation as the solution to the Jewish question. The birth of psychoanalysis in Vienna coincided with the election of the first anti-Semitic municipality in a major European city. Freud observed his alumnus, the University of Vienna, become a center of pan-German chauvinism and anti-Semitism. Viennese student fraternities excluded Jews, and Austrian students demanded a quota to limit admission of Jews into Austrian universities. Austrian academics taught that anti-Semitism was justified on intellectual grounds. For example, the highly regarded Orientalist Adolf Warmung, a professor at the University of Vienna, taught that Judaism was fanatically hard-hearted and the Jews had a satanic character which even conversion to Christianity could not change. So this was the environment of growing secular racial hatred in which psychoanalysis emerged. And the science of psychoanalysis is, of course, totally antipathetic to notions of the primacy of race or religion. In its Viennese historical context, psychoanalysis was a humanist answer to religious and national conflicts which had recurred in Europe for centuries, as well as to the new racial science. Freud stresses essential truths, universal, secular, humanistic elements uniting all humankind, drives and instincts, the Oedipus complex, the primacy of childhood and early experience, trauma in early development, sexual experience, memories, dreams, jokes, errors, the totality of human consciousness and unconsciousness in which religious differences in this wider context are superficial, in comparison. In his writings, Freud dismissed religion as a source of backwardness and superstition, a form of immaturity and neurosis, and notoriously in Moses and Monotheism, he called Judaism a fossil. Freud puts emphasis not so much on secularism per se, but on the equality of human beings, if not in the eyes of God, then in the eyes of nature. At times we feel that it is the equality of wickedness and suffering. Anti-Semite said Jews are inferior. Freud says, basically we are all the same. There's no fundamental difference. Freud's contemporary at the University of Vienna, Theodor Herzl, was also aware of the genocidal danger of racial anti-Semitism. In his diaries, Herzl condemns Düring and the other racial anti-Semites in imagery reminiscent of medieval times and prophetic of the Holocaust. Old Christian Jew hatred was weakening, he writes. Racial anti-Semitism was a more efficient modern fuel for the incineration of the Jewish people. The Jews, Herzl wrote, had to understand that they were living in enemy territory. He had no doubt that the Jews must die or get out. Unlike Herzl, Freud lived long enough to see the truth of this prediction when he was forced, after the Anschluss of 1938, to leave Austria. The catastrophic ending of Freud's life contrasted with its optimistic beginning. Freud was born at the height of the emancipation movement. The outstanding political event in Freud's early life, which affected his secular outlook, was the emancipation of the Jews in Austria-Hungary when the empire was united in 1867. Freud was then 11 years old. In later years, he evidently looked back at this period as an age of lost innocence and childhood dreams. It seemed then that every industrious Jewish child, including himself, had hoped to become an Austrian cabinet minister, now that the barriers between Jews and Christians had come down. A secular education, in Freud's view, was essential in broadening the humanist beachhead, spreading tolerance and understanding. To become a scientist, to make new discoveries, to increase our knowledge of the world and of ourselves was the highest ideal, and this would help to ensure that ancient religious hatred would never return. Around the time of the emancipation of the Austrian Jews, Freud's father told him a story which he relates in the interpretation of dreams. When he was a young man, he was walking down the street in Freiburg, Freud's birthplace, and an anti-Semite came by and knocked his hat off and told him to get off the pavement. Now, Freud's father said, we see what a contrast there is after emancipation, for the world has at last changed for the better. Freud's secularism was based on universal humanistic principles in which nothing human was alien. Like many Austrian Jews, Freud was immersed in secular German culture, associated by 19th century assimilated Jews above all with Goethe and Schiller, who represented the tolerant, liberal face of German identity, opposed to church doctrine and backwardness, including its anti-Semitism. Enlightened liberalism and secular education opened the way to Jewish emancipation and assimilation. After the French Revolution, increasing numbers of Jews in Western and Central Europe looked to secular ideologies as weapons against the anti-Semitic church, which was bitterly opposed to Jewish emancipation. But by the end of the 19th century, it was clear that Jew hatred and general racial and national stereotyping were so deeply ingrained in European culture that even secular ideologies could be infected by them. The extremity of Freud's public rejection of religion probably derived partly from his conviction that religious conflict and hostility had caused much suffering in the past and had the potential to bring catastrophe in future. Privately, Freud might have been more sympathetic to religion than he lets on in his writings. In his letters to his fiancée, Martha Bernays, in the 1880s, Freud occasionally expresses favorable views on religion, though the qualification should be added that Martha was the granddaughter of the chief rabbi of Hamburg, and that she, despite Freud's secularizing influence, remained attached to Judaism and Jewish rituals throughout her married life and after Freud's death in 1939. Isaiah Berlin once told me when I was a student at Oxford that he visited Freud in London in the late 1930s, and it happened to be a Friday evening, and he witnessed the extraordinary spectacle of Freud and his wife bickering over whether to light Sabbath candles. Yet over 50 years earlier, Freud had written to Martha praising the life-affirming practice of ritual blessing. The law commands the Jew to say grace over every fruit, which makes him aware of the beautiful world in which it is grown. The Jew is made for joy, and joy for the Jew. At moments in Freud's life, religion seemed less of an illusion than the notion that Jews could gain acceptance in an anti-Semitic Christian society. He made a confession to Martha remarkable for an avowed secularist. I have often felt as though I had inherited all the defiance and all the passion with which our ancestors defended their temple, and could gladly sacrifice my life for one great moment in history. It might have been difficult for Freud to assert such unscientific sentiments in his books, even in the interpretation of dreams, which contains Freud's fullest inner biography. In the interpretation of dreams, Freud declares his identification not with Jewish zealots who fought against Rome, but with Hannibal, who, like the zealots, heroically fought Rome and lost. Like many emancipated Jews with a secular education, who were often immensely grateful to their countries of citizenship, Freud was a nationalist in his youth. And I think it is true to say that he remained an Austrian patriot throughout his life, particularly during World War I. For 5 years at the University of Vienna in the 1870s, Freud, evidently influenced by his father, a staunch German nationalist and admirer of Bismarck, was an active member of a radical German nationalist student society, the Leseverein der Deutschen Studenten Wiens. Like Herzl, he abandoned his German nationalism with the rise of anti-Semitism, which left even the most assimilated Jews little choice. As Freud's biographer Peter Gay writes, Gentile fellow students expected Freud to feel inferior and a stranger to the Austrian people because he was a Jew. In his so-called revolutionary dream, Freud recoils from nationalism in the face of anti-Semitism at the university and elsewhere, and to his surprise, he expresses fierce German nationalist feeling, but then finds that the gates to the university are closed off to him, a symbol of his exclusion. There's a Yiddish joke, which Freud was fond of telling, which expresses this exclusion, the realization that he, like other emancipated Jews, were actually vulnerable to expulsion. An impoverished Jew stowed himself away without a ticket in the fast train to Carlsbad. He was caught, and each time tickets were inspected, he was taken out of the train and treated more and more severely. At one of the stations on his Via Dolorosa, he met an acquaintance who asked him where he was traveling. To Carlsbad, was his reply, if my constitution can stand it. Similar feelings of homelessness and victimization were expressed at the same time in the 1890s by Herzl. We have everywhere tried sincerely to merge with the surrounding national community. It is not permitted us. In vain are we loyal patriots, even super loyal in some places. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of blood and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to increase the fame of our native lands in the arts and sciences, or their wealth by trade and commerce. in our native lands, where we have lived for centuries, we are still decried as aliens. Freud's Viennese contemporary, the playwright Arthur Schnitzler, was also troubled by the unbridgeable gulf between Jews and Christians. In the novel The Road to the Open from 1908, he writes that nothing, not assimilation, not Zionism, socialism, Jewish self-hate, or even conversion, would free the Jews of fear of persecution. The only way to freedom was through the inner life. The roads into the open do not run through the country outside, but through our own selves. It is this inner path to freedom that Freud seeks in psychoanalysis. I would like to conclude by suggesting a parallel between Freud and the writer whom he admired above all others, whose writings he believed anticipated practically every insight in his own works. I'm referring to Shakespeare. We know little about Shakespeare's religious beliefs, but we do know that at the time of his emergence as a playwright in the late 16th century, England was in the grip of violent anti-Catholic feeling. Shakespeare's career began at the time when Catholic Spain repeatedly tried to invade England, destroy the Protestant church and monarchy, and restore England to the true faith, Roman Catholicism. At this time, English Catholics were hunted and persecuted, imprisoned, tortured, and put to death. It was a capital crime to practice the Catholic religion. For a Catholic priest to be on English soil was a capital offense. In this environment of violent intolerance and religious hatred, what do we find in Shakespeare? We find, above all, the emphasis on universal human values, human character in all its spectacular variety and fascination, of fundamental human virtues and flaws, jealousy, love, ambition, generational conflict. So anxious is Shakespeare to defend humanistic values in the little globe of the Elizabethan theater that he gives even the Jew, the archetypal target of institutionalized Christian hatred, a human face. At the core of The Merchant of Venice, first performed at a time when Jesuits were being put to death in England, is an attack on religious hatred and assertion of Shylock's universally comprehensible motive, revenge for the persecution and humiliation he has suffered as a Jew. Shylock's great speeches attacking Antonio for his anti-Semitism and defending his right to revenge are unique in European literature before the time of Lessing. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? To which Freud might have added, hath not a Jew the Oedipus complex? Shakespeare is suggesting that even the hated Jew, guilty of the crucifixion and the denial of the divinity of the Savior, is nevertheless a human being, not a devil. And this was certainly true of Catholics as well, and all other victims of religious bigotry. In their respective ages of religious hatred, Shakespeare and Freud created an intellectual territory based on universal, secular, humanistic ideals, and above all, reverence for the human individual in which religious bigotry could have no part. This legacy is no less valid today than it was in Freud's time. Thank you.
I would like to thank Carolyn Berman for this invitation. I want to thank you all for coming out. It's a marvelous crowd. And I want to thank Professor Aberbach for setting things up so well, and now I don't have to, because I'm going to do something rather different. In my book, I also take a look at Freud in a sort of more general intellectual context, specifically with relation to classical studies. But as I looked at what we were going to talk about today in relation especially to secularization and his impact on American culture, I realized, well, I'm not an expert in Jewish intellectual history, nor am I an expert on American culture, but I am an expert on me. And so I thought I would do something that Freud himself does, which is to make a specimen of myself. So I'm going to give you something of a secular coming out story as I work into talking about Freud and secularization. I first met Sigmund Freud in 1980. I was a freshman at the University of Chicago and was being subjected to that wonderful great books curriculum that puts you into such stunningly weird situations. I found myself reading Plato's Republic in one class and the Interpretation of Dreams in another. This was a jarring experience, and I never quite got over it. After many years of doing other things, I returned to write a book on Freud in the ancient world, and I suppose that was my working through that freshman year trauma. Freud's work, like Plato's, was what I termed in my youthful way productively irritating. A book like The Interpretation of Dreams isn't simply annoying to a freshman, it's enticing, cajoling, preposterous, and profound, and all at the same time. And it offended that great religion into which most of my friends were then becoming initiated, science. We argued at great length over the viability of creating a science of the personal, which in a sense is what psychoanalysis might be seen as. Humanities type that I was, I held forth on the importance of rich meanings, while my scientist friends blasted me on the matter of rich methods. And now that my scientist friends are old enough to really need some therapy, I look forward to restarting the argument. Now, I was the son of devout and provincial parents. I could probably say devoutly provincial parents. Good people, hardworking Presbyterians, liberal enough to go to anti-war rallies, but only because they thought Jesus would want them to. Those were very different times. I was discreetly exiting the religious life like so many in college, and there at the gateway to hardcore secularism was Sigmund Freud, my newfound co-irreligionist. That's a word he liked, Unglaubensgenosse. It was a term he applied to Heinze that Heinze had applied to Spinoza. I wanted Freud to hand me a new set of certainties, and as you know, I was to be greatly disappointed. The first thing to know about Freud is that he enjoys disappointing people a little too much. Much of the reading I did my freshman year was of works by Greeks and Jews, and sadly I was neither. I came to know for really the first time just what a vibrant and dangerous term Jewish intellectual was. It connoted something powerful, trenchant, fearless, progressive, at times perhaps corrosive, but certainly modern. And I marveled at how utterly opposite the connotations of the words Catholic intellectual are. In the Catholic case, we think of something subtle, apologetic, timid, neo-Thomist, conservative, reined in, if not outright compromise. It was clearly better as a budding secularist to side with the Jewish intellectuals, whatever they were selling. As I was thinking about this, I suddenly remembered what attracted me to Freud at the tender age of 17. He had the remarkable ability to be simultaneously generous and rude. And I remember just where I first realized that. It's in the notorious opening salvo in Civilization and Its Discontents. Now, as you know, that little book is a powerful distillation of a lifetime's worth of work and experience. If The Interpretation of Dreams is a sloshy red wine on a leisurely afternoon, Civilization and Its Discontents is a fighting man's whiskey on a dark night. Freud's friend Romain Rolland had taken him to task for his previous attack on religion, The Future of an Illusion. But Rolland objected not to what he'd said about religious organizations. Rather, he thought Freud missed the point that any good psychologist ought to see. All religion has an empirical reality in human sentiment, what Rolland called the oceanic feeling. It is a feeling of eternity, of something limitless and unbounded within us. One may, he argued, call oneself religious on the basis of this feeling alone, even as one rejects every system of beliefs and every kind of traditional religious illusion. So thought Rolland. Do you see what a great opportunity that was? Freud could have joined Rolland in saying that there's this groovy feeling at the heart of religious experience. He could have then said, but hey, the groovy feeling can now be experienced outside of the religious framework, especially now that we have psychology to help us frame it. Freud had his moments of solidarity, after all, where he would mildly advocate for a life of communal striving in the light of reason. It would have been at least polite to agree that this was a nice feeling to have. Rolland's moral credentials as a pacifist and a voice of reason were impeccable. Wouldn't joining him be a politic way of embarking on some initiative to found a secular morality? But what Freud does instead in Civilization and Its Discontents is to argue politely but irrevocably that Rolland is being a big baby. You see, the feeling of oneness with the universe that stands behind the oceanic feeling is really just a regression to a stage when the ego was not yet well defined, when the boundary with the world was not well policed, so that one could feel indeed a lack of separation, a connectedness to everything. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, two things. First, it leaves the self defenseless, since Mr. Ego's not in charge, and we must suppose we are thus liable to all sorts of unhealthy manipulation. Secondly, Freud just never had this feeling, or so he says. I rather think that he did have this feeling, but gave it a very different name. The drive to break down and become one with the world at large sounds a lot like the death or destruction drive. In Freud's metaphorical matrix, where energies circulate in an economy of desire, aggregation, and discharge, the oceanic feeling is just too entropic to be consoling. You can't build society out of entropy. So he said he never felt it. Certainly not as something positive, at least in relation to religious institutions. He simply claims he's never been invited to this party. Quote, "I cannot discover this oceanic feeling in myself," he says. "It is not easy to deal scientifically with feelings," says the man who made a life out of attempting that very thing. Within a few pages, Rolland's secular interpretation of religion based on a psychological description has been rejected because it fails the force test. This groovy feeling cannot be a sufficient source of energy to justify the ubiquitous apparatus of religion. Why does the oceanic feeling lack energy? It is not the expression of a strong need. So the oceanic feeling is too weak a battery to power all the churches, synagogues, and mosques of the world because nobody needs it enough. It is at best a secondary effect. And suddenly in this pungent little essay, we are thrown back into the arms of the Father. Quote, "The derivation of religious needs from the infant's helplessness and the longing for the Father aroused by it seems to me incontrovertible." And this switch in the argument happens so fast you feel the room spinning. Now Freud positions himself to argue in his accustomed way to be as rude as he likes in the name of his science. The next chapter of Civilization begins with the venom of a truly militant secularism. Religion is simply a big pacifier to appease infantile needs, or as he says, quote, "The whole thing is so patently infantile, so foreign to reality, that to anyone with a friendly attitude to humanity, it is painful to think that the great majority of mortals will never be able to rise above this view of life." Here are the strident tones of Freud's younger self, I would say. The Freud of the 1870s, who read Feuerbach fervently, embraced Darwinism, materialism, who was ready to burn down the old pieties with the torch of reason. It was, after all, Feuerbach who had argued, quote, "The feeling of dependence in man is the source of religion." Like other secularists of the age, Feuerbach pleaded with humanity to take itself seriously and give up the Middle Ages at long last. It's time to stop being religious, since we now live in the age of science. Freud, emerging from a religious tradition, that is Judaism, he did not wish to carry along, and threatened by another religious tradition, that is Austrian Catholicism, he did not wish to adopt, hewed to the secularist path. Though he dabbled in the secular religion known as German nationalism for a time, he settled on the path of science. But Freud was no mere echoer of Feuerbach in the 19th century. For Feuerbach, the object of our dependence, the true object, therefore, of our religious devotion is nature. In the simple way of 19th century secularists, Feuerbach apodictically announced, quote, "Nature is the first original object of religion, as is sufficiently proved by the history of all religions and nations." End quote. Once you decode religion as a system of projections, you'll see that it's really all about nature and man's place in it, he argues. Then you can drop it and deal directly with nature through science. Freud's view of religion was much more focused, as we've seen. It's not the dependence on nature that fuels it. It's the infantile need for the Father. So Freud powers up religion now with a kind of nuclear reactor, our dynamic ambivalence to the Father, an ambivalence generated in our own childhood conflicts, but exacerbated by a phylogenetic inheritance of guilt from primordial times. This is where you cue the spooky music. Freud's view of religion thus constitutes a curious kind of backdoor patriarchy, one he elaborated in grisly detail in Totem and Taboo. The living primal father was the original problem. His murder and cannibalistic devouring by his sons, a temporary measure that failed to get to the heart of the problem of his power. The primal father was gone, but their remorse and longing made him more powerful than ever. And so, as Freud's Just So story goes, this primal horde of humans created totemism and exogamy as a lasting solution for their ambivalence. And this is the origin of all culture and art and religion, etc. The tyrant, the father, became a god. Mere power morphed into authority. And this, I would say, is a rather Roman solution, the deification of the dead emperor. Harold Bloom is certainly right in saying that there is little that is Jewish in the story of cannibal savagery, unless you feel Jews have a unique claim to feeling guilty. I think every religion usually makes that claim. We all want to feel guiltier than other people. This scientific myth constitutes Freud's big, sort of cultural Big Bang theory, as I say. Such a powerful, traumatic event released energies that, when reinforced through the epicycles of repetition played out in families, bind us with a terrible force to civilization. In his last book, Moses and Monotheism, he does indeed examine the tradition he comes from, but only in the light of his own myth. And Judaism, he's pleased to report, is a perfect confirmation of psychoanalysis once you get the story straight. To understand the uncanny authority of a Moses or a Jesus, you have first to get back to the primal father, or what he came to call the Urvatertragödie, or the tragedy of the primal father. Far from Feuerbach's nature, we see now that the stages of religious development come in terms of a chain reaction threaded through uncanny fathers throughout history. And of course, we have to ask, where does Father Freud fit into this chain? Now, I've laid some emphasis here on the concept of energy, because you'll never quite get Freud's view of religious institutions unless you focus on the flow of forces. He's not interested in combating religion solely as a source of outmoded ideas in conflict with scientific explanation. He wants to get down into its engine room and understand why such irrational systems remain so powerful. These are the real human energies we need to address, describe, subvert, and tap. Secularism can never win by spouting beautiful ideas. It needs to give us new things to feel guilty about if it wants to beat out its old rival. And in all fairness to Freud, he was right in a sense. We secularists, standing on the wreckage of so many good efforts at replacing religion with something else, can hardly claim we've succeeded. We're still coming to terms with its power. So paradoxically, Freud needed religion. He needed it as any good pathologist needs perfectly sick people. After all, religion, seen as a collective neurosis, was the bridge that made possible the extension of psychoanalytic theory beyond the consulting room. Religion responds to the need for the father, which thereby makes religion itself proof of the need for psychoanalysis. Freud made much of the analogy between the individual and collective neurosis. Like the city-soul analogy in Plato's Republic, it was good to think with for a time. But it proved difficult to move out of the analogy when confronted with other ways of thinking. And it was damned rude to insist upon it with decent people like Romain Rolland, the man whom Stefan Zweig once called the moral conscience of Europe. But that was Freud. He knocked back the oceanic feeling with a dual instinct theory, whereby civilization was a titanic struggle between love and death, whose outcome is still uncertain. This tragic, titanic, energetic view of civilization is doubtless what makes Freud compelling, even when he's not convincing. I think that's why his presence remains strong, though I, for one, suspect he's been converted into more of an icon to kiss or shatter than a thinker to contend with. We can certainly discuss here today whether, again, the peculiar contours of his thought are largely shaped by Jewish experience, if not by Jewish tradition. And that's a distinction we might explore, the difference between what I call the trajectory, the Jewish trajectory of psychoanalysis, which is very much a fact historically, sociologically, in the development of the psychoanalytic movement, versus, again, some other view of what Jewish tradition is vis-a-vis psychoanalytic thought. But I want to leave this off for now and insist that from my Goyish perspective, in my 17-year-old mind, Freud was a rude awakening. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to set my stopwatch here. Got 20 minutes, and And as a favor to you, I'm going to set it for 18 minutes. And do my best to come in under the clock, I hope. I really enjoyed those talks. Those were great. I have to make one disclaimer. I left academia 4 years ago exactly this semester, and had been doing playwriting mostly ever since. This is actually the first time I've heard an academic lecture in 4 years. And 4 years ago, my mind was swimming with dates. I could have told you, when everyone was born, that I had to bring my book with me, not just to remind myself of what I had written. So I just wanted to say that. So and those were really fine talks. I learned a lot from them, and I'm very appreciative to be here. So I want to thank the program and thank all of you for coming out. I thought we'd be in a small seminar room with about 12 to 15 students, and so I'm, in yet another respect, totally thrown against the ropes here. I'm going to. I think my talk is really going to focus on what the book I wrote a few years ago focused on, and this is I was trained in American history, though also did Jewish studies, and I think one way to understand what I'm going to talk about today is within the context really of American ethnic history, the way in which ethnic groups in America engage with ideas and try to put themselves onto the larger stage. In order to gain greater acceptance, actually. So to some degree, the story I'm telling, which happens to focus on Freudianism and the way one ethnic group in America dealt with Freudianism, is in some ways, it's a template for how ethnic groups in general in America may well engage with the larger society. I'll start with two quotes from Freud's Moses and Monotheism. One, Freud says, "As if the world had not enough problems, we are confronted with the task of finding out how those who have faith in a divine being could have acquired it, and whence this belief derives the enormous power that enables it to overwhelm reason and science." I wanted to start with that because in some ways what's framing my contribution today is this larger question of the struggle between science and faith. At the time, many of the people that I studied, which was late 19th, early to mid 20th century, although the book does go up to the present day, it was inconceivable to most people going back before really the 1960s that religion would still exist in American society as a very powerful entity. One of the big surprises of, my lifetime was that religion not only maintained its hold in America, but in fact became even stronger in some respects. So it gives a whole new valence to what Freud was talking about then. He was dealing with a world in which Christians and Jews and others, I'm focusing now mostly on Europeans and Americans who are mostly Christians and Jews in background, were dealing with entrenched orthodoxies. He's speaking from that perspective. And again, today we have really fascinating dialectics, Christians, Jews, Muslims, others, between these two poles, and in some ways more in the news than ever. The struggle of biblical Abrahamic religions to deal with modernity. The second quote from Moses and Monotheism, Freud said that by dematerializing God, that is coming up with a God that really has no name, as the Bible says, the Torah says, Bible, Torah, however you'd like to call it. God says, no name, I am that I am. That's God's name. Okay, no name. And that this is a dematerialized God. You don't see this God, and this God is represented through a Mosaic tradition. That's what he means by dematerializing God. The Jews preserved their inclination toward spiritual interests. And he said this inclination helped to build a dike against brutality and the inclination to violence, which are usually found where athletic development becomes the ideal of the people. Freud, why I mention this, Freud was certainly philo-Semitic. He was a Jew who was fond of Jews. I think this comes out partly already today. Not all were. One reason that Alfred Adler, once a student of Freud, then broke off to create his own very powerful school of psychology, really is not as well sort of publicized, he had a worse PR machine than Freud, was because Adler, as a socialist, sort of distanced himself from what he would have considered ethno-piety, sort of, rah, rah, rah for the Jews and the ethnic group. Freud was like talking about Jews and Judaism. Freud was a very proud Jew, and the coterie around him, this didn't hurt, let's put it that way, in terms of getting out the word. The reason I take these two quotes is because the second quote has to do with that you have a figure here who became iconic for American Jews. And he became iconic not only because he was a secularist, and a secularist who came up with a competing theory of human nature and behavior, one that could compete with religion's theory, but because he was a man who felt that the Jews, in the parlance of his time, had a special genius. Now we say cultural traits, but in the late 19th and early 20th century, people used the word genius a lot, like the genius of a people would mean that group somehow had some qualities that distinguished it from other groups. People like to talk about the Jews as having, a national genius towards a certain ethical way of life. Freud believed that this was true. He believed that history had given Jews this gift, that their 2,000 or thousands of years of sort of living in a certain way, in a halakhic way, according to the traditions of the Mosaic tradition, as I guess he would have put it, had actually made Jews spiritually tough, spiritually strong. So when he contrasted them to cultures which emphasized the physical world, he saw the Jews as superior to that. Okay. Now let me move ahead then. So just to summarize this, Freud became an iconic figure in really American Jewish culture and for American Jews. I think those were two of the reasons why. Catholics in America had the Pope in terms of a great, important authority figure. Well, Jews had no Pope. Jews had Freud, a great potent authority figure. And because they had Freud, because Freud, and I'm going to move to my next point now, Freud became, in America, venerated, a venerable figure. Why should that be? He's not an American, he's an Austrian. He was here once, and at Clark University, yes, he was distrustful of the tendency in American culture to do what it did do to him, which was to enter him into the mass market, and thus to dilute and change his views, and certainly give us a much more optimistic Freud than Freud was, as we've heard before. In fact, just a brief digression, which will lead me. It's not a digression, I guess, but it'll take an extra 20 to 30 seconds. There's a famous photo of Freud's visit to Clark University where he spoke. 6 figures. Freud seated. Freud, G. Stanley Hall, the president of Clark and a founder of American psychology. Next to him, Carl Jung. Standing, A. Brill, who I'll talk about some. Ernest Jones, a British important student of Freud's. And then Sandor Ferenczi, also Jewish. And in this picture, I noticed at one point, I'd like to have this picture as the cover picture of the book. It didn't end up being the cover picture of the book. The cover picture of the book ended up being this, which just sent my mother into a complete. I'm not lifting it to sell the book, believe me. It's over. It doesn't move. It sells a -1 copy a year at this point. But the picture that they went with, my mother called me immediately when I sent her the galleys and just freaking out that this was going to create a new wave of anti-Semitism in America. She did. It took me days to calm her down about that. The picture that I wanted to have there, I noticed in this picture that the 3 Jews, that the non-Jews in this picture had very serious looks on their faces, as people usually did in photographs at that time, and the 3 Jews are smiling. And I wanted to just caption this: why are these Jews smiling? And in a way, ironically, they had reason to smile, because 2 things happened in America, which really, who would have predicted this? One, Freud became enormously popular in America, way more popular than he was in Europe. And 2, Jews were very important as purveyors of Freud to a mass audience. I realize my cell phone's not going to work because then it goes to my main screen. How am I doing on time? 6? I've spoken for 14 minutes? That's unbelievable. 7. Oh my God, okay. You see, I've been out of this too long. There I am. This is what happens. You hang around actors for years, and now I'm just going. I can't believe that's 14 minutes. Okay, well, here we go. I can be very concise about this. One, it happened to be that America had, early on for various reasons I won't now detail here, a very buoyant, an extraordinarily buoyant mass market of inspirational literature, going back to Ben Franklin's day. 2, with the rise of modern psychology in the 1880s, psychological writers, psychologists, psychoanalysts, people like that who wrote about psychological things, they became an increasingly important component of this mass market of inspirational literature. Basically telling people, how can you improve your life? How can you be happier? How can you be better? This sort of thing. It still goes on today. Dr. Phil would be one of the most recent. Joyce Brothers, very important Jewish figure, was from the 1950s to the 1990s, America's most well-known psychologist. America's first most well-known psychologist was a German Jew, Hugo Münsterberg. Jews, point 3, have been disproportionately involved in the enterprise of American psychology from the beginning. The first popularizer, the first really prolific popularizer of psychology in America was a man named Joseph Jastrow, the son of an eminent Talmudist and professor at the University of Wisconsin. So Jews were very involved in this new element of American life, which became bigger and bigger as the 20th century unfolded. There was a huge mass market here then, as there is now, for psychological uplift and advice. What this meant was something unusual in cultural history. As long as, generally speaking, before this mass market, psychological mass market developed, Christians got their advice about how to improve themselves and live a better life and attain some happiness from Christians, priests, ministers. Jews got their advice from rabbis. That's how it went. But now, if psychology becomes an avenue for this kind of public preaching and public advice, well, now those old barriers are gone. Jews, for the first time in history, as far as I can tell, although I'm sure I shouldn't make a statement like that, had a mass audience that was ecumenical. They liked that. And I think one reason they liked it is a reason something that plays through ethnic psychology in America in general. Ethnic minorities in general are in a very tense relationship to the larger society. In some ways, the theatrical definition of hysteria, I think, almost fits. You've got two characters in a scene. The way in which to get one hysterical is to have that character asking something of somebody where that other person cannot possibly give it, can't give it. Ethnic groups are in that position in America. Ethnic groups don't want to be tolerated in America. They want to be appreciated, even loved in some sense, as they see themselves. And as a result, it's a futile enterprise because, at best, an ethnic group will gain tolerance and some degree of respect. So in some ways, I think that what this new audience, this new arena that was opened up here to Jews gave them a unique way to actually speak about some distinctly Jewish concerns, mention some distinctly Jewish themes, and thus gain a larger kind of acceptance and they hoped, I think, to change American attitudes so as to produce an American public that was more congenial, more accepting to people like them, outsiders. And a series, 3 minutes, how many am I have now?
Say 5.
5? Well, okay, 6. Carolyn said it. It ain't me. Carolyn said it. So let me now just, very briefly in the remaining times, I'll just throw out a few examples of some of the people that were involved in this enterprise. Freud's first interpreter for the American market was Abraham Arden Brill, a Jewish immigrant a student of Freud and a prolific popularizer of psychology. A second one, a man named Isidore Coryat, a child of Moroccan Jews, became the preeminent popularizer of Freud in the Boston area. Ultimately, he wrote the first, for the American market, the first explanation of Freud's interpretation of dreams. And when men like Coryat and Brill wrote, they didn't write in the same way that non-Jewish, in this case people from Protestant backgrounds, who were popularizers of Freud wrote. This is probably one of the key points. In other words, when we talk about anything, we talk about it from a specific vantage point and context. That can be an ethnic or religious context, among others. So among all the popularizers of Freud in the United States, there were two main groups. One of Protestant origins. Catholics came into this game much later for reasons I won't go into. And Jews. These were the two contingents of early popularizers of Freud in America. And one clear difference was that the Jews, when they popularized, they had a tendency to mention Jewish things, Jewish case studies in some cases, and also to present observations or insights that they got from their own Jewish tradition. After I want to do this so that I can get this all in. I'm gonna move next. In the first period, 1890s to the 1940s, this was solely an enterprise of people trained, they're medical doctors and psychologists. In the 1940s, a rabbi for the first time did something very, very big. He became a reform rabbi from Boston, wrote a book called Peace of Mind. Came out in 1946. It was the biggest selling inspirational book since 1900 in America. Went on to sell 1 million copies very, very quickly. Liebman was, in that period, unfortunately he died very young at age 41, the most famous rabbi in America. So let me now just very briefly in the remaining times, I'll just throw out a few examples of some of the people that were involved in this enterprise. Freud's first interpreter for the American market was Abraham Arden Brill, a Jewish immigrant a student of Freud and a prolific popularizer of psychology. A second one, a man named Isidore Coryat, a child of Moroccan Jews, became the preeminent popularizer of Freud in the Boston area. Ultimately, he wrote the first, for the American market, the first explanation of Freud's interpretation of dreams. And when men like Coryat and Brill wrote, they didn't write in the same way that non-Jewish, in this case people from Protestant backgrounds, who were popularizers of Freud wrote. This is probably one of the key points. In other words, when we talk about anything, we talk about it from a specific vantage point and context. That can be an ethnic or religious context, among others. So among all the popularizers of Freud in the United States, there were two main groups. One of Protestant origins. Catholics came into this game much later for reasons I won't go into. And Jews. These were the two contingents of early popularizers of Freud in America. And one clear difference was that the Jews, when they popularized, they had a tendency to mention Jewish things, Jewish case studies in some cases, and also to present observations or insights that they got from their own Jewish tradition. After I want to do this so that I can get this all in. I'm gonna move next. In the first period, 1890s to the 1940s, this was solely an enterprise of people trained, they're medical doctors and psychologists. In the 1940s, a rabbi for the first time did something very, very big. He became a reform rabbi from Boston, wrote a book called Peace of Mind. Came out in 1946. It was the biggest selling inspirational book since 1900 in America. went on to sell 1 million copies very, very quickly. Liebman was, in that period, unfortunately he died very young at age 41, the most famous rabbi in America. Liebman was the first eminent clergyman to undergo Freudian psychoanalysis, and his book, Peace of Mind, though just billed as an inspirational book, was essentially his distillation of Freudianism, and his melding of Freudianism with Judaism for a mass market. The last figure I'm going to mention, just to mention a few, is Erich Fromm, who was a person who was part of the University of Exile here, an emigre German. Fromm was an Orthodox Jew into his 20s. He became a very popular writer. His book, The Art of Loving, is, I think, still in print. Has sold 25 million copies and counting worldwide. So Fromm was a huge writer in the inspirational market, certainly one of the more highly intellectual ones. And Fromm would be another example of a person steeped in Judaism whose books, though they're about human psychology, brought into the mainstream into mainstream America concepts and quotations, aphorisms, examples that came straight out of Talmudic Judaism. To wrap some of these things up, what happened, I would say, is that these Jewish writers, when they brought Freud and Freudianism, bundled Freud in a way that was different from when other writers brought Freud into American culture. And one of the biggest distinctions was that writers from Protestant backgrounds tended, especially in the early years of the 20th century, to bundle Freud with an American transcendentalist mentality, which was made most famous by Ralph Waldo Emerson and culminated in popular 20th century religion in Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking. This was a view which tended to spiritualize the psyche and the unconscious. This was a very popular view. It's still a very popular view. The idea that what Freud showed us was the unconscious, and the unconscious is a portal to the divine, a portal to God through which one can change. Jews hated this message. Across the board, every Jewish thinker that I studied, certainly up through the period of Liebman and Fromm, they rebelled against the idea of a spiritualized unconscious or a spiritualized psyche. They were ardent, we now call them physiologicals almost in their approach. They were ardently secular about that point. And I think one reason was I think they saw danger. That bordered on irrationalism for them. So one of the contributions, or that's probably not the best word, but one of the contributions that the Jewish interpreters of Freud brought into the mainstream audience was this idea that whatever Freud does teach us about how to deal with inner conflict, it conforms to a kind of Jewish moral perspective which emphasizes not a very dramatic struggle, not an apocalyptic struggle, but a sort of patient, daily struggle against what in traditional Judaism they call the Yetzer Hara, the evil impulse. And that by studiously, diligently trying to counteract the evil impulse, one becomes a better person. But the Jewish people involved with distilling Freud for America categorically rejected ideas that somehow in the psyche would be some means of a radical, instantaneous transformation of human nature. And now I know I've gone over 20 minutes. Sorry. Thank you.
Our first speaker has to leave it promptly at 7 o'clock. So I'm going to ask him a few questions, and then if you want to address questions to him, we'll have a little bit of time, and then we'll continue with the other two speakers. A question I have really to ask all three of you, but I want to ask you primarily, is you use the term secular now as if it's perfectly clear what we mean by it. If there is any term that seems to me that is being widely debated in all areas, across the humanities, across the social, what we really mean by secular, it's the term secular and, of course, secularization thesis. So it seems to me that one has to clarify what you really mean when you say that Freud is a thoroughgoing secularist. But the other question I want to ask is that there are certain things that you say that don't quite make sense, or at least in Freud's life, they don't seem to me to make sense. Because if you made him in simply to be the humanist, the secularist, then forget all about Jewishness and Judaism. Yeah. I mean, how do you explain the fact that in the Hebrew edition, translation of Totem and Taboo, Freud opens that with the statement, how can it be asked that I, who have repudiated the religion of my fathers and who repudiate religion, consider myself to be a Jew? And he says, in German, in the essential sense. So what is the essential sense that Freud is a Jew? It's certainly not matzah and rye bread, and it's certainly not rituals of things. So it seems to me that there were just many. How do you explain the fact that for all his secularism, for all his claim that religion is a form of neurosis, that throughout his life he was proud and sometimes at great risk to assert his Judaism. He associated with B'nai B'rith, etc. So I want you to, A, speak about what you really mean when you say that Freud is a secular Jew, a secularist. And secondly, what does Judaism have to do with secularism, and in what sense is Freud still a Jew? I'll begin with that.
Well, I was mentioning to Caroline before that one of the difficulties we have in understanding Freud's background is that he burned most of the documents pertaining to his early life, and he did not really make it easier for biographers. I think Peter Gay's biography of Freud covers his early life, the first 20 years, in 20 pages. So what we know is very limited, and these are fascinating questions to which we don't have clear-cut answers. And I found that just about everything you can say about Freud has some kind of opposite. For example, I mean, he says that he wrote his fiancée a few weeks before Yom Kippur in 1883. Am I to fast at Yom Kippur? Surely not. And he even considered, when he was about to get married, the possibility of conversion. He said it was too problematic, too complicated, to convert. Now, I think one has to go back into the world of 19th century assimilated Jews in Central and Western Europe to understand the context of these contradictions, because I think it was assumed if you were emancipated, if you were to go out into the world, if you were to become a doctor or lawyer, or to live, as it were, in a secular existence, you had to make compromises on your Judaism. You had to, if not convert, you certainly could no longer feel comfortable with traditional Judaism and with the Jewish community. And I think to some extent there was a reaction against the dominance of rabbinic Judaism. When Jews came from a rabbinic background, they were often reacting against it because they felt at that time it was backward, it was full of superstition. If you read the autobiography of Solomon Maimon, you see very clearly how repulsed he is by Judaism. He's repulsed by Jewish mysticism, by the Hasidim, because they're so full of ignorance, because they live a wholly religious way of life, which doesn't allow them to live. It doesn't allow them to explore genuine thinking. It doesn't allow them to become rational beings. It's as though Judaism and religion generally was antithetical to reason. And so Freud has to be understood in this context in which religion is very much more dominant than it is today, and not just Jews, but anyone who is seeking to live a non-religious life is really going to be breaking away. It's not like today where you can reconcile these things, you can balance them, where there's tolerance for all sorts of different kinds of identity. We're talking about a continent which in Freud's age was still dominated by theological categories and prejudices.
But you make the issue more perplexing. The reason you make it more perplexing is, granted, everything you say. And that's why we know so many people in Freud's circumstances who repudiated their Judaism. So many people in his circumstances who converted because that was the way to get out. But
Yes.
he didn't.
He
And he did not. And at the end of it, near the end of his life, at the 30, he says, I am in the essential sense a Jew.
Yes.
So one has to come to grips with that in
Yes.
some ways. One can't just deal with the Enlightenment scientific side. We know that side of him. It's the other thing that I think is complex. In some ways, one has to come to grips with that kind of seeming paradox. The seeming paradox of a man who, in his last lives, is obsessed with writing a book on Moses and the monotheistic religion, not writing the new science of psychiatry or psychoanalysis.
But that is characteristic of the struggle on the part of educated Jews to break down the differences between themselves and non-Jews.
You see, what
Because,
I'm really proposing, that's really a hard question.
I know,
What is a
it's
secular?
unanswerable.
Well, what is a secular Jew? Why isn't? I mean, it
Yes.
seems in some sense we use the term all the time, but if you think it out, there's a kind of incompatible. If you're a secularist, thoroughly of the type that you're talking about, humanist, universalist, scientific, who the hell needs any kind of Jewishness?
Well,
I don't really think it's that difficult a question, although I appreciate the adversarial nature of it.
And Freud.
Einstein.
I'm asking about Freud.
I'm sorry. Yes. No, I know you're asking about Freud, but I think it's okay if I quote Einstein just for a second. Einstein was asked this question, and he compared Jews to a snail, Jews like himself, a snail who'd lost the shell. And he says that doesn't thereby make the snail any less a snail. So while I appreciate there's a lot of complexity involved in the definition of a term secular Jews, of course there is, I think that for someone like Freud, and for anyone who in some ways has had extensive contact with Jewish traditions, I think the misnomer is in the sloppy way we use the misnomer has to do with the word secularism.
Yes.
I don't know that if you take a secular Protestant, a secular Jew, I know when I studied the American humanists, who were either originally Protestants or Jews, secular Protestants and secular Jews aren't exactly alike, though they're both secular. And the reason they're not exactly alike, Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, two founders of American humanist psychology, one from a Protestant background, one from a not very religious Jewish background, but they brought to bear a different sensibility, which isn't to say that they couldn't speak across that. It seems to me, though, not that mystifying that if a person is raised in a ethnically or religiously dense culture, it wouldn't be surprising that though they disavow a belief in God, that they would still be marked by that background.
What we should do is, in fairness to the audience, since has to leave, are the questions just directed to him. We'll go on after he leaves.
okay. I did want to mention that Freud's essay on the Moses of Michelangelo, because there he does give an insight into the nature of his Jewishness. Freud wrote an essay before World War I in which he discusses the Moses of Michelangelo in Rome, in San Pietro de Vincoli, and he visited this church, and he sat there day after day, just absorbed by this wonderful sculpting. And you would imagine that he is identifying with the idea of the lawgiver, that just as Moses gave the law to Israel, so also Freud, as it were, gives a new law, a modern law, a law based upon the study of human nature, of the unconscious. This is, as it were, a Torah for the modern world. That's what one would have thought. But no, he says, and I quote, "Sometimes I have crept cautiously out of the half-gloom of the interior, as though I myself belonged to the mob, upon whom his eye is turned, the mob which can hold fast no conviction, which has neither faith nor patience, and which rejoices when it has regained its illusory idols." That's an extraordinary admission that he is part of those Jews who rebel against the Torah, and he is, in effect, worshipping the golden calf, as this is the analogy. So he is not the, I suppose, the lawgiver who is laying down the law. He is admitting a kind of heresy here. He is admitting an element of guilt, an element of betrayal, that yes, he's proud of his Jewishness in a social sense. He's proud of his membership in B'nai B'rith, for example. He's proud of what he has achieved because it brings credit to the Jewish people. But in a religious sense, in the sense in which his father was Jewish, because his father was an Orthodox Chassid from the town of Tismanitz in Galicia. In that sense, Freud knew that he had broken away, perhaps irrevocably.
Okay. Other people who want to ask questions?
I think I have to go because
have to go?
yes.
Oh, okay. Okay. Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Maybe I just raise one general question that the two other speakers can address, which
I would like to chime in, if I may.
on that issue.
Well, first of all, again, when you talk about something like secular Jewish identity, what is identity, right? Is it like a Halloween costume? One fixed thing, you put it on and there it goes. Again, I tend to come back to the idea of trajectory because I think when you look at what Freud says about Judaism and Jews, etc., it develops over a great deal of time. And there are a lot of dynamic elements. And so one thing I would throw out, for example, is think of Jewish identity in Freud's case as in part an oppositional identity. That is to say, he feels with great tenacity, often backed into a corner because of the reality of Jewish life. And he's a good hater in a lot of ways. He's up for the fight. And think of the Hannibal complex, right? That great moment that we talked about when his father is trying to explain to him this moment of humiliation on the street in Moravia, and he's deeply disappointed in his father because he wants him basically to go, knock the crap out of this guy who knocked him off the sidewalk. And his father says, "Well, I picked up my hat," because that's what they did, right? That was the tradition. It's how you survived. And I think that's very important to kind of keep in mind because there's many key moments in Freudian biography where you see him committing himself physically to the struggle against anti-Semitism. There's a wonderful letter about when his sons were on a lake, I think it was in Bavaria, when they were on vacation, and local Bavarian anti-Semites were sort of taunting them, and he went after them with a big stick, And I've always thought about that because this shows a degree of certainty and commitment, physical commitment, right, that is kind of a constant. For example, in his relationship with Zionism, his son Martin at the university joined Kadima, the dueling fraternity, and was afraid his father would not like this because many assimilated Jews thought that these guys were sort of troublemakers. But in fact, he was proud of him for doing this and later became one of the honorary members of Kadima. So when you think about these elements of identity, especially in these sort of tense situations, and you think of them in terms of historical trajectory, I think we can easily see why one can have a downright physical commitment to something, to not denying you're a Jew, to attacking anti-Semites, with a stick if you need to. At the same time that there are these sort of intellectual problems left over in reconciling this. I don't know if you would like to.
No, I actually want to go back to something that Andrew said, because I wasn't really trying to make the point that Freud is either a Jew or a secularist, because I think what's so interesting is that he was both. And that's what you have to come to grips with. And what Andrew, and so the view of Freud, that it's only science, that religion is primitive, that it's an illusion, that there's nothing much to Judaism, is too simplistic, as he beautifully brought out. In a way, if you read the Moses book with care, it's an enormous defense of what Andrew said, of the contribution that Mosaic monotheism has made to Western civilization, and he identifies with that. So my point was not one side or the other, but that Freud, that you have to bring out that complexity.
I agree with that entirely.
Yeah.
The thing that I think interesting is that there's the polemical Freud, who likes to approach a certain clarity in relation to what he even talks at one point as a sort of dictatorship of reason. Extraordinary language. And again, coming to this from someone from a different trajectory, it's amazing how often you're disappointed by his lack of follow-up on any kind of sort of secular agenda. And I think part of the reason why is, again, I would go to the experience of secular nationalism that he went through as a German nationalist, that he was, like other Jews, uninvited from that project at a certain point. That remained a wound with him. I think that's why every time he talks about nationalism, he's shying away from it precisely because it is a wound, something that he had wanted and had to let go of. I think in that sense, again, we come back to some of the different dynamics of identity. In the dream, where he has this sort of nationalist feeling that comes out in the dream, right, he's surprised by it, again, that it's still there.
I don't know if either of you want to speak to this, but I think it's certainly in the air, is that, look, in a way, from both your talks, that one holds up Freud as, in the proper sense, a great idol of an intelligent, enlightened secularism. But I wonder if you want to address the issue that secularism is radically under attack today. That it is not being, even if we just restrict ourselves to America, this is not a secular country in one sense. And that the great hypothesis about secularization is that in the end religion is going to disappear from it is just false. And so what are we to make of that in relationship to Freud? I don't know if you want to address this. Or maybe you disagree with it.
Well, no. Two things came to mind about your question. Yeah. And by the way, I appreciate that you threw a compliment into me, and so now I'm going to recategorize your question. Originally, I thought it was adversarial. Now I think it's brilliantly adversarial. Now, because I'm very cheap. I'm cheap. I can be bought at a very low price. Just throw me another compliment, and I'll be sending you money.
You quoted the most important statement in Moses and monotheism.
When you raise this, two things come to mind. One is that in some ways, for a secular Jew, orthodoxy created that possibility by saying that a Jew, because take a very pious Jew dealing with a Jew who's long ago given up God, that Hasid doesn't say, well, you're not a Jew anymore. They never say that. You're still a Jew. Yeah. Come on into the van and put some tefillin on. In other words, the Jews themselves created a condition wherein a person actually is considered Jewish anyway, whatever you think. In Christianity, that's a tougher deal because there's a creed. If you don't actually believe that Jesus is the Son of God, then you're really not a Christian. So
Well, it's worse than that. There are many brands of Christianity. So, God forbid you're a Baptist and you become a Mormon.
right. And so that was one thing that came to mind, that the conditions were actually created by the nature of traditional Judaism. The other is, in 1902 in New York, the anarchists held a Yom Kippur ball in which they served ham and lots of other things. That's one way to understand a secular Jew, because a secular Catholic isn't having a Yom Kippur ball. He's having something on Lent, but not on Yom Kippur.
Okay, maybe we'll open it up to discussion. Are there questions? Yes, back there. Oh, you have to, because they're archiving this, would you wait for a microphone?
I can be heard.
No, if they want to record you, you're going to be there forever.
There's two questions that I wanted to throw out, and I'm sorry David Aberbach left because I wanted to ask him. He spent a lot of his time talking about how legitimate anti-Semitism had become in Germany, Russia, and Eastern Europe. My question relates to Paul Krawczyk's book, The History of the Yiddish-Speaking People. And he speaks there about how for 1,000 years, Jews had a special status in Eastern Europe. Because they were educated, the nobles hired the Jews to manage their estates, and so the peasantry had to deal with their Jewish overseers, which created 1,000 years of resentment, I would imagine not unlike the Irish attitude toward the British. And that resentment went toward the Jews as well as toward the Catholic prelates who contributed to the oppression of the peasantry. And Krawczyk points out that often what we refer to as pogroms were actually rebellions, and he refers to one that occurred in 1869, the title of which I was never able to pronounce, and so I can't remember it, but in 1869, where there was an explosion, where they actually killed more Catholic priests and bishops and nobles than they killed the Jews, but it was an explosion of the peasantry toward all of that. So I wanted to suggest to Professor Aberbach that his presentation could be more balanced by including both these aspects rather than just pointing to the anti-Semitism. The second question I wanted to ask him was the difference between secularism and Zionism. Would Freud have approved of the creation of the State of Israel? Would Freud have approved, he must have known Theodor Herzl, or at least heard of him, would Freud have approved of Jewish nationalism? Jewish people identify themselves as an ethnicity and as a religion. You can discard the religion, you still have the ethnicity. How did Freud deal with that? Thank you. Sorry to take so long.
Well, one thing is, again, coming back to the idea of oppositional identity, right? Freud admired Jews who stood up for themselves, always. Physical, manly courage. This was something that he admired. So in that sense, in the city of Vienna, for example, when students at the university who've been, told that they're not allowed to duel with other dueling fraternities because Jews have no honor to defend, et cetera, when they stand up for themselves, he admires that. So Kadima, again, the Zionist fraternity, was something that he could admire. At the same time, however, again, when it approached an actual project of nationalism, it made him very uneasy. And after 1933, Arnold Zweig, the German writer, left Germany and immigrated to Palestine. He wrote to Freud about things that were going on, and Freud was concerned, basically, about the violence that was going on as it was being represented to him. He thought that there were Jewish settlers who were acting in a way that was going to kind of provoke conflict. And so, in that sense, the reality of a nationalist project, as the sentiments of a nationalist project, were disturbing. And I think this goes back to a question someone asked, I can't remember if it was you, about the failure of secularism. I don't think Freud would be surprised. Again, coming back to the issue of national identity. As I was trying to relay in my sort of self-ironic way, he knows how powerful these irrational forces are, and looking at secular projects like revolutions, again, he writes about the Russian Revolution to a certain degree and what is promised by Marxism, and of course he sits there and sees what's going on in Germany. He's well aware there's a danger that these great so-called secular changes in society, which if you consider his lifetime from 1856 to 1939, I mean, he witnessed a vast amount of change, politically and otherwise, right? That you see these so-called secular nationalist projects largely sort of reoccupying the dynamics of religious identity, exclusion, etc. In other words, that you really can't get beyond this. And given the way he sees the human psyche in relation to its aggressive drives, always needing someone to beat up on, and as a Jew, he knows who that's going to be, right? There is an element of despair in him that I think, is really hard for him to overcome. So I think, if you were to say today, if Freud, we could bring him back, through, I don't know, some miracle of DNA modification, I don't think he would be surprised.
No. I'd second that. I think it would be more than he wouldn't be surprised if he gives an explanation. I mean, against, and that's another kind of interesting nuance about Freud. I mean, clearly he is in the tradition of the Enlightenment, and he hopes and believes that reason will prevail. But there is this other aspect in which he knows the power of the return of the repressed. So it seems to me that actually Freud is tremendously useful in understanding what, against the idea that we're not going to have extremism and militarism and fanaticism, that Freud gives us the, you might say, the resources for understanding why that happens.
But there's justification for the resentment. The same way that the Catholics were criticized for being papists.
Yeah.
The Enlightenment Protestants were terrified that the Catholics were going to, come as a wave over America.
Yeah.
And turn us to.
Okay, we want to get out of the questions. Okay, yes, over here. Over there.
I just want to comment on that last statement. That means that if you carry that to the next step, that means that the Jews deserve the Holocaust. So I have a lot of trouble. I have a lot of trouble with that kind of formulation. I'm going to ask one question. That is, can you comment on? That's my question. These two. Can you comment on the premise that Talmudic and rabbinic tradition is, as some have suggested, Hasidic? I think my sense is that that's not the case, and that if one takes the long look at the Talmudic tradition, one will find in it a lot of built-in things that are not considered religion, like the tradition of the apikoros, or the person who rejects religion entirely, but who is yet becomes part of the literature as an important figure. The second question, which builds on that, is that I'd like to suggest, and I'd like you to comment on, the possibility that secularism is premised on the notion of religion. Without the notion of religion, as someone said, without the notion of a perfectly pathological individual, there's no work for the pathologist. That these two categories are false categories. They are categories established by the Enlightenment, especially the French Revolution, in which European countries needed to categorize its people in religious terms in order to give citizenship. My sense is, and I'd like you to comment on this, and is that Judaism is not a religion. Therefore, the notion of secularism doesn't apply. Let me put it another way. The experience of the Jews in their political and social and religious aspects, all of which are different and separate, or at least intellectually are different and separate. The experience of the Jews is not a religious experience, although it may contain, in part, a religious experience.
Do you want to speak about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I didn't exactly get, I think I got the gist of what you're saying. And it's true that the words we use, Judaism is a good example. That word doesn't make sense in a traditional Jewish framework. And so, I mean, if that's what you're getting at, that's true. Judaism was not a religion. That is a modern way of talking about these phenomena. And before, whenever these terms became current, I think that's true what you're saying, if I understand what you're saying, that Judaism was a way of life. The halacha, well, halacha is a walking through, right?
I'm not suggesting that that's the case.
Well,
In fact, I'm suggesting that that's not the case. That halacha was not the sole way in which Jews lived or lived. That is a misconception of the history.
okay, I don't know, could be, I mean, but it seems to me, well, first of all, I think scholars, and again, I was in American history, not actually in Jewish history, but I know for some time that the term is Judaisms, not Judaism. And so scholars will talk about it because it's hard to pin down and say Judaism is this. There's such a multiplicity. And I think that certainly has been true in the past as well. So right, I think these are words or terms of convenience. And that's why also I think with this secular religious thing, when the word secular I think doesn't mean what we often take it to mean, that it's much more organically connected. If you look at a particular individual who's secular, that probably there's an organic connection between that person today as a non-believer in a deity and that person's heritage, personal heritage.
Let me just say two things. First of all, as I recall, the term Judaism, Judaismos in Greek, was first coined in opposition to Hellenismos or Hellenism. In other words, it's a concept that emerges in a context of conceptual friction, right? Not organically as a banner under which Jews array themselves, but in this sort of interesting conflict. I think it's in the Hellenistic period when that word first is used in Greek. Sorry?
It's not there in the Torah.
Yeah, exactly. Similarly, the word secularism is kind of interesting. It actually does make a certain sense from a Christian point of view, which is to say the saeculum is the here and now. And if you live your life constantly worried about eternity, you are obviously thinking you are in the world but not of the world. And therefore, secularism is a commitment to the here and now from a Christian perspective that is renouncing an eternal life. And that, as you know, if you know anything about a lot of denominations of Christianity, is a big thing, right? To basically say, I no longer care about my eternal soul. So from that perspective, it may be that secularism in the Jewish context does not have the same lift or drama in it. Because the entire nature of either Jewish theology or Jewish religious practice or relationship with eschatology is different. So in that sense, for me, I'm going to hell. I know that, but I'm not sure what's going to happen with y'all.
You're going to hell, but you don't believe there is a hell.
Right. And
Other questions over here? Over here. Yes. Again, you have to wait for a microphone.
Well, I think everybody.
No, they want to record you.
I'm just wondering whether the panel could comment on why you, apparently all of you, find it so difficult to reject the idea, not accept the idea that being a Jew is being a Jew, and it just is what it is. You grow up, it's around you, and there's no real way of not being one, and that there is a branch of Judaism, the actual fifth branch of Judaism, secular Judaism, secular humanistic Judaism. There are about 25,000 such in the U.S., and why this seems to be such a difficult thing to accept, that I am a Jew, just like I'm not a Greek American, I'm a Jewish American, I'm Jim. But I'm also extremely secular, and and humanistic. Why do some find this so difficult to accept that these two merge, and several other strands merge in me very easily, without conflict, without difficulty.
Who finds it difficult? I don't know that. That was pretty much what I was saying before, so I'm not sure.
Again, I think the distinction is, I know why I'm not a Christian, because I have to profess a certain creed and do certain things to remain one. So my dues have lapsed, and I'm in trouble. I do find, though, just so you know, there's a curious vestigial Presbyterianism that leaks out in me, like my tendency to sign up for committees. It's a very Presbyterian thing. I also know certain ethical things that are very much a part of my judgment that I realize are not there in other people. I know where the origin of that comes from, even though I don't sit down and say, oh yeah, I learned that from the Bible, And so in that sense, this is a conversation I've always wanted to have with Jews, frankly, because you can't do this and be a Christian. I would like to be able to tell my mother, I'm a secular Christian, but there's no such thing. So, she weeps every night, and, that's where we leave it.
Yes, over here. Yeah. Oh, over there. There's someone else.
I came a little late because one of the postings said 6:30, not 5:30. But anyway, mostly to the
You missed the
gentleman.
best part.
Mostly to the. Actually, I like this part best, the interaction. To the gentleman in the gray shirt, I missed. So I don't know if you spoke on. Now, someone made a comment about ethnic and religion, and there's always been a fight with my friends growing up in Brooklyn, who a lot of them were Jewish, and saying it's a religion. They never look at the ethnic. Now, you look at Lenny Kravitz, who's black, and his first wife, Lisa Bonet, who's a Jew. And they're the only couple I ever know who actually had a kid who's authentically half black and half Jewish, all the way through. So when you studied all these Jews, did you ever study the good Jew who's a Jew, who may not be, ethnically Jew? It sounds like these are the only Jews that you're talking about. You're not, what about the other Jews that are good Jews who may be black, Spanish, green, purple, a Muppet, whatever?
You want to speak to it?
Is this to me?
I think it's you.
It's
to you, direct to you.
I'm not exactly sure what when you say a good Jew.
They follow all the rules. They go to shul. They do everything correctly. They eat the right food. They really believe.
And what made you think? Okay, yeah. Okay, so what made you think that I was not also talking about those Jews? I'm not sure.
I may be wrong. I just asked. My question
Oh.
is, did you study?
Oh yes. Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, the project which I'm sort of condensing part of today is from a book which includes the whole
Were any of them psychologists?
It includes an entire really the whole spectrum of Jews, from Jews that were total non-believers in God to extremely Orthodox Jews. So sure, the whole spectrum.
Because Ruth Messenger is
Okay.
at Kimmel as we speak.
We want to get some other people.
Jews in Africa that goes through the whole nine.
Yeah, in the back there. Oh, you have a question. Okay, yes.
I think it was a question about Judaism without
Thank you.
Yeah, that's what he wanted to know. Like black Jews.
I actually, is this
You want to
working?
raise
Yeah.
your question, and then if he wants to say
I'd love
something.
to.
It's
One, and then you, okay? Oh, sorry, you want to say?
I'm sorry. Was your question about people who convert to Judaism? That was some.
Yeah, I mean, people who aren't born ethnically Jewish. They're like, Ruth Messenger right now is at Kimmel with a whole Haiti thing and a whole thing. Ruth Messenger is in Africa getting all these people to be Jewish. They're doing it, they're being good Jews, and they're getting turned away in Israel and other places because they're black.
Oh, okay. Yeah. See, I wasn't sure what you were talking about. I mean, in terms of my own personal definition of a Jew, mine would be much broader than that of conventional Jewish views. I mean, my own kids, their mother was not Jewish, and although they were raised with a lot of Jewish tradition, I couldn't get one of them into the Hebrew Academy in San Francisco. they just wouldn't take her. And so does that mean I don't consider her Jewish or something? No, not at all. But within certain groups of Judaism, they would not. So,
Okay, look, we want to get other people in, please.
Yes,
Yes. Go ahead. Yes. Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Just one quick question, I hope. All of your talks about Freud were about Freud being a secular Jew. I believe that's the way you said it. Don't you have the noun and the adjective reversed? Isn't he a Jewish secularist? And given the intellectual ferment in Vienna when he wrote the Vienna Circle and the like, isn't that really what he is? And I think your focus in terms of your first question about secularism should be further flushed out given what occurred in Vienna when he did these things. Was that quick enough?
You want to say anything about this? Okay, let's take the question then.
yes. I'd actually like to build on, it's related to what you said, because the whole question of what is a Jew, is it an ethnicity, is it a religion, is it a race? And you have used the term racial prejudice here, talking about the history of anti-Semitism, and I've seen that in other places. There are people who consider Jews a race. And I feel like we haven't quite taken that thing apart. I mean, of course, there are Ethiopian Jews. They are people who happen to be, I don't know, whatever, but they practice a form of the Jewish religion. What do you think
they're not a
of
race.
that?
It's clear Jews are not a race. That's just clear. Jews are not a race. As you yourself explained, there are Jews of every known, quote, racial group. So they're not a race.
Well, I believe that, but
Right.
but you were talking about Jewish history and using the term racial anti-Semitism and not attacking it as it's untrue. I thought I was hearing that.
I think
Yeah.
it's a historical description of the way Jews have been conceived by non-Jews. That was the issue in terms of conceiving it in terms of race. Many things were conceived of in terms of race. That really, when you look at studies of ethnogenesis now, people realize this was a horrendously crude instrument that was pseudoscientific or scientific for the time that was being applied regularly to these populations. And sometimes by Jews. I mean, there's a really odd book called the Taufjude by Fritz Wittels, and he gets into this discussion of survival, which is one of the questions, right, from the evolutionary point of view, the amazing survival of the Jews. And Wittels comes out and says, it's shameful, because if Jews really fought, because again, there's this idea of oppositional identity, of wanting to fight, right? They would have been wiped out. So in a way, it was shameful, right? And it's a strange thing for a Jew to say. He has this point where he says, I wish fewer had survived and more had fought. So there's this kind of, Masada complex, right, in this thinking. But again, those are the scientific categories that were being bandied about.
This gentleman's question wasn't answered, so am I right?
Best as I can
Yeah, no, I don't know why it glossed over. Yeah, and so you're asking why are we describing Freud as a secular Jew as opposed to as a Jewish secularist, correct? Yeah, and I mean that's a good question. I hadn't really stopped. Partly it's such a conventional locution, but so to flip it, he would be first and foremost he's a secularist who happens to be Jewish. I'd still, again, it would be something I'd have to think. I'd still lean towards secular Jew, but again, that's because where I'm coming from, I don't know if this would be shared by others. I would see someone like Freud as really so formed, as he himself, I think, would agree, certainly age 0 to 5, as so, I think, formed in some ways by a Jewish world, that I would tend to have that be the noun myself and secularly adjective, but that's just one.
I think it also depends what you want to stress. I mean, if you really want to stress the fact of his dedication to science, his belief in rationality, his conviction that that religion is literally a form of neurosis, his insistence that psychoanalysis is a science and not a Jewish science, then you could see why you would give the weight to the secular, And if you wanted to do other things, like his identification with B'nai B'rith, his sense of being proud of it, his disdain for all kinds of ritual, but nevertheless never flirting with conversion, then you might go the other way.
He did define himself once
Yeah.
in a conversation later in his life, and he said, I used to think of myself as a German Jew, which again speaks to the Habsburg Empire, where there were linguistic ethnic identities within this large kind of imperial structure, and being a German speaker was a prestigious thing. But he said, after what had happened with German nationalism, he called himself merely a Jew. And in other words, you could write German Jew and cross out German, and that's kind of the identity. That speaks to the wound of his secular national identity that I was talking about. That is what he says. In terms of calling himself a secularist, I don't believe he's ever used the term.
I don't think he ever used the term.
Wissenschaftler, scientist, absolutely.
Yes.
Alfred
Microphone,
Adler,
can I-
I'd agree with you. Alfred Adler, I would call first and foremost a secularist.
Can I ask a question? I have
Oh,
microphone.
yes, a question. Oh, I have a question. I'm sorry.
David before mentioned Michelangelo's statue of Moses, which has horns. So I have two questions for you. Number one, why did Michelangelo put horns on Moses? And number two, was Michelangelo anti-Semitic? Thank you.
I'm going to let you take that one.
As I recall, it's an issue of translation, and I don't remember whether it's the Vulgate translation or which it is that renders, and some here, a good Hebraist will jump in and tell me what is at issue here. So that's partly it. This particular depiction of Moses is based on an interesting fact of mistranslation.
Right.
As far as Michelangelo's anti-Semitism, I'm afraid I don't know. Yeah, the Catholic. Yeah, and so in the Catholic Vulgate Latin translation, he is horned,
Okay,
which I think is interesting.
Another question? Did I see there is somebody? Yes, you had a question. Over here. Over there. You have a question? You have a question?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
It's, years ago, I did a little bit of work on Baruch Benedict de Spinoza, and I made some comparisons.
I can't hear you. Could you?
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I didn't want to startle myself with this thing. Years ago, I did a little bit of research with that involved Baruch Benedict de Spinoza, Hegel, and Judaism as structural concepts. And my question for the panel, I guess, is, for anyone who's familiar with him, could you say that Baruch Benedict de Spinoza, in regard to his ideas on cognition and structure, might correspond conceptually with Judaism insofar as it can be considered a living practice?
I can't answer that.
If he can't answer that, I can't answer that. But I'm glad you answered that.
Right.
It's not because it's not an interesting question. I know it's so far afield for me.
Hello?
I couldn't attempt it.
Hello? Let's go back to a question.
Wait, there was a question here. One second.
Okay, a quick one, hopefully. Could you talk about the idea of a Jewish essence? It seems like when Freud tried to solve the riddle of his own Jewishness, I think this was in one of his B'nai B'rith speeches, he said that he believed in a Jewish essence. He just couldn't articulate what exactly it was, but he said that science would prove him right someday.
He says that in the Hebrew translation.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
In the preface to the Hebrew translation of Totem and
Of
Taboo.
Totem and Taboo. That's right. That's right. That seemed to be his attempt at an answer, and maybe you could talk about that.
I mean, the thing that comes to my mind was something I quote, semi-quoted and referred to, his belief that Jews had a spiritual, that their essence would be this spiritual gift or genius in the parlance of that time. That's what comes to my mind to answer the question. That we would now, after Franz Boas used the word culture, not race, but now we'd say, he would have said if he was using the term culture, that it was a cultural tendency developed through many years of living in a certain way. But that would be, I think, the trait that he saw as sort of had become essential, as if it were inborn.
Again, I would
Hello?
add two elements to that.
Hello?
One simply that he did feel there was a character trait of tenacity, intellectual tenacity, that was one of the reasons why he felt being a Jew was helpful in coming up with an unpopular science. That is to say, he was able to think unthinkable thoughts because he was a Jew and was used to being in the minority. You know, it's kind of interesting when you think about it, because a lot of what he talks about his experience in high school. His humanistic gymnasium in Leopoldstadt went from having a Jewish minority to a Jewish majority by the time he graduated, right? So, but you know, that element of intellectual tenacity and kind of almost an intellectual machismo, you know, is there. Besides that, though, there is another thing that's relevant to psychoanalysis, and he thought in terms of sexuality, Jews did not have resistances to overcome that Christians did. Hence, they had fewer resistances to psychoanalysis, and that's one of the ways he explained why so many Jews flocked to it. And so, again, what you'll see filtered sometimes in discussions about the fallout with Carl Jung or problems with other Christians who are interested, J.J. Putnam, for example, a very prominent Harvard neurologist, he will largely see it as the problem fundamentally of Christians not having the advantage of the Jewish relationship, direct relationship with sexuality, that they have a lot more elements of repression to get to work through on their way to psychoanalysis. So there are ways in which there's an intellectual advantage to being a Jew, some of which is historical and some of which seems to have this kind of element of the psychophysical, you know, sexual constitution.
And he also said, now I'm remembering, it's been years since I read, I think it was the B'nai B'rith lecture you're talking about, where he does talk about, right, an intellectual freedom that he thinks Jews inherit.
Right.
And I remember also he was fond of this joke about schnorrers, the Jewish beggar, and the way he interpreted all the schnorrer jokes is that the schnorrer who's got nothing and is asking for other people's money, that he sees himself as on an equal plane. He doesn't defer. And I recall now, he thought that this was also something which was a trait, a cultural trait of Jews, a kind of an egalitarianism. And what I meant by spiritual gift, I'm sorry, I should have been more precise. He thought that Jews were more emotionally self-disciplined. And he had in the back of his mind the phenomenon of pogroms. He thought Jews were less likely, in other words, to engage in that kind of violence.
I think.
On one thing, let's go back to Aquinas. When he talks about Christians being ethical, they count long interest. It's assumed Jews are out of the path. They're damned anyway. They can get away with anything. They can be unethical. That is a basis of anti-Semitism in the West. If you go back to Aquinas.
Well, it's not the way Freud thought about anti-Semitism, but I think on the notion of equality and the schnorrer joke, we should end the panel. Okay.